I'm Daryl Travis, the CEO and founder of Brandtrust. Brandtrust is based in Chicago. We're privileged to be advisors to many of the top brands in the world. You can think of us as the intersection of behavioral and social science and marketing, and so we have that very very sort of special niche that we fulfill. We've been doing storytelling training for many years. We were first prompted to do it by a couple of our large clients. So we bring the idea or the perspective of social and behavioral science to the whole background of storytelling. So with that, Jake, let's go to the next slide. Human beings have always told stories, and stories are really the essential form of human communication. We understand life and make meaning in our individual lives through stories. Our beliefs, our cultures, our behaviors are rooted in the stories and the oral traditions that have always been shared around fires and fireplaces. In the beginning, the stories were really crude utterances that we voiced to try to share and describe experiences. Over time, these primitive accounts became folk tales and songs and legends that forged beliefs and tribal norms. And then later still, these tales became proverbs and superstitions and customs. Eventually, oral traditions took on the form of the painted word. And this scene here is from the famous Lascaux cave in France's Dordogne Valley. It was discovered in 1940 when 4 young boys and their dogs stumbled upon the site. We can only imagine the stories these boys may have told about this experience throughout their lives. Interestingly, though, the artwork depicts hundreds of animal figures, was painted around 17,000 years ago. Images from the cave are widely considered to be really among the earliest known narrative artworks. Archaeologists tell us that the world's oldest recorded story, that's more than 44,000 years old, is a cave wall depiction of a pig and buffalo hunt. So clearly these expansive accounts weren't just crude doodles, but they were huge and sophisticated projects that were created by storytellers and artists, our ancient ancestors, who were depicting beasts and risky hunting scenes. The images framed really the heart of their cultures, and it was their narrative, their stories for living their lives. These stories were told visually before we communicated with the written word and the common language. Long before Stonehenge or even the Egyptian Empire, this is what stories looked like. And we might think of this as the first PowerPoint presentation. Crude, but certainly a way to think about it. So the point of it is, next slide, Jake, is the thing that's really fascinating about this is that if you're a human being, you are a storyteller. We're all natural born storytellers. That's because it's the essence of human communication. It's how our brain works. And it's important for us to think about that in the context of what we do with brands. We crave stories. We need stories. Stories are how we learn to live our lives. We're instinctively and irresistibly drawn to stories. Who hasn't heard a child say, "Daddy, tell me a story"? "Mommy, tell me about the time when"? In fact, we may have said that ourselves. Probably most of us did. Stories are timeless. They're usually told to ensure survival or to warn us about danger or maybe to map the path to food. Stories transfer knowledge. Stories help us stay alive. Stories create connections between ideas and people that are emotional and inspiring. Whether it's around the dinner table, at the movie theater, in Super Bowl commercials, or in presentations, we're complete suckers for a good story. It's why we love jokes, riddles, movies, and anything that offers a story experience. It's because our brain craves to learn new things that help us to navigate life. And that's what we do with a story. Story is a new thing. And one of the reasons, like, for example, why we love jokes so much, think about it, is that a joke is a progression through a story, and your brain is saying, okay, I understand this, I know what this story is about, I understand what's being shared, but then the joke takes a left turn. And when it takes a left turn, your brain immediately thinks, oh my gosh, aha, I've learned something. This is a different way to think about this. And endorphins fire off, neuroepinephrine, all the positive things in the brain that says, I learned something new. The brain loves it. The brain enjoys it. So the drive, the need for stories for a human being is insatiable. And if you notice, when we're sitting in a meeting or attending a lecture or a message in church even, If it's a subject that really interests you, or you really want to hear it, you still will drift off. You'll become distracted by something. Anything in your mind or something will steal your attention away from that presentation. We're all naturally daydreamers as well. Harvard University researchers surveyed more than 2,200 people on their iPhones to ask them what they were doing and whether their minds were wandering. The researchers discovered people spend almost half their waking hours thinking about something other than what they're doing. Can you imagine that? Fortunately, though, stories have the ability to snap back our wandering minds. We're quickly pulled into stories. We can't resist stories. We're likely to be completely distracted until that presenter begins to share a story. Our brains are constantly scanning for story cues. Your mind may be 1,000 miles away, but if it hears a signaling phrase, when the speaker starts to share something like, I remember a time when, or in 2012, we saw something new in our market, it signals a story is coming. And our brain is immediately fixed on what that speaker is sharing. So it has this amazing ability to just snap us back into our thinking and our attention span. So let's flip to the next slide, Jake, and we're going to look at this slide kind of quickly. Just look at this list. We think we make sense of the world with data, but let's take a look at data without a story. Take a few seconds to try to memorize as many of the words as possible as you see on this slide. Okay, Jake, change the slide, new slide. Now, not a lot of time to think about that, but that's the idea, right? That list of bullet points helps us to understand that our brains remember stories, not data points. Those data points are the kinds of things that we usually use in our PowerPoint presentations, the things that we try to communicate in business. They're hard to remember, if not impossible to remember, but when we transform it into even a very short story like this, Jane led the company to a record-breaking quarter. Those are the same words, the same bullet points that were in the previous slide. It makes all the difference in the world. So we didn't recall the slides, but now we look at the same data in story form and consider how much easier it will be to remember this story rather than those bullet points. I think it's important to recognize the irony that they're called bullet points for a reason. That's because they're deadly. They tend to destroy the story behind the data and make it much harder to receive it and store it and pass it on to others. Stories create structure for understanding the world and ourselves. Discrete facts carry little meaning, but if we use our working memory to build story, we remember it much better. We want to make sense of things. We want data. We want things that can be proven. We want to cover our butts, is what it boils down to in many cases. We think we need proof in the data, but in so doing, we lose the story. We lose the human factor. We lose the communications aspect of it. And so we want to begin to understand the power of story and how we should use it in business. That's why the best way to communicate and teach is in story. We do it so naturally. It's how we connect, how we understand, and how we learn. In fact, we usually use some form of story to make sense of data in our minds. If you think about the greatest teachers throughout all of human history, when you ask them a question, they never answer the question directly. They tell you a story. It's a parable, it's a story, it's a tale, because they know that's what makes them the greatest teachers. They know that's how human beings learn. You think of a practical example even that almost all of us probably experienced, is you'll probably recall how we were taught the musical notes, E, G, B, D, F, right? E, G, B, D, F seems simple enough, but in order to remember it, we needed to turn it into a little thought, a very short story. Every good boy deserves fudge. And so that's just a slight small example of how even a very, very short story can make all the difference in the world. One of the most famous short stories was written by Ernest Hemingway. And the story is what we like to refer to as a 6-word story format. And that story was Baby Shoes for Sale, Never Used. And you can make almost anything you want out of that story, but think of that. That is a 6-word story. Think of the beauty of the power of a small short story like that. Next slide, Jake. So stories create structure for understanding the world and ourselves in a way that data cannot. Studies into memory retrieval confirm that the human brain stores memories in specific sequences of neural activity that can be replayed again and again. We store and retrieve memories in sequence. So we're behavioral scientists, so I'm going to get a little geeky on you here for a moment, but this is important. This is important to think about in terms of how we use stories and why it makes a difference to our brands and our businesses. Memories and stories are retrieved by association. This is why you can remember what you went upstairs for when you go back, only when you go back to the room where you first thought about it. So I don't know about you guys, but even sometimes I open the refrigerator and I can't remember, but if I go back to where I started the thought, the beginning, the progression, the association begins to help me remember. When you're trying to remember someone's name, for example, you might replay an earlier introduction in your mind, trying to remember if the person's name was Scott James or was it James Scott? Oh my goodness. Now, neuroscientists have found that in the split second before you come up with the right answer, your brain's neurons fire in the same order as when you first learned the information. So we have all this information that's being entered into our brains, but our brain sorts through it and orders it, as you can see in the chart. So we learn in sequence and we retrieve in sequence. We also know that the context of learning matters in a really significant way. If you meet someone at a social event whose name is James Scott, and you're like me, you're very likely to forget his name. But if he tells you his name is James Scott and he's a baker, you may never forget, you may forget his name, but because of the context and the association, you'll probably won't forget he's a baker. You're very familiar with the connective thoughts associated with this story: flour, sugar, ovens, breads, cakes, and donuts, and all those images in your mind that triggered and sequenced when he originally shared his profession. You simply have more to work with, and you'll never forget that he's a baker, because your brain it painted a whole picture, it painted a whole story. And the brain actually thinks visually more than it does in words and sentences. So the old adage, one picture is worth 1,000 words, is more true than we ever realized. So you might present the facts about someone and immediately think of that person as good or bad, but you're able to see those facts within context. When you're able to see those facts in context, they have much more meaning. Okay, Jake, next slide. One story is greater than 1,000,000 data points. So the idea here is that just an example of a case where we see this every day, but this is a good case. We partnered with International Justice Mission, a humanitarian organization that provides legal rescue for victims of modern slavery. Believe it or not, modern slavery is a very, very critical issue around the world. They were telling a pretty complicated story about who they were and what they stood for. It was full of statistics and how many people they help and a list of all the ways they help. And our behavioral science advice was to tell more stories about specific individuals who've been helped by IJM's efforts. Here's one story. Kofi remembers the day he left home. He was 8 years old. His mother introduced him to a nice man. The man told him he'd take Kofi to live with him and enroll him in school. He'd give Kofi a better future, a future his mother couldn't give him. It was all a lie. Instead, for the next 2 years, Kofi worked as a slave on the shores of Lake Volta, a giant man-made body of water in East Ghana. Every day, Kofi woke up at dawn to fish for his boatmaster. Kofi dove deep into the lake, holding his breath as he used his small fingers to untangle the nets caught on tree stumps underwater. He knew some boys drowned doing this. One day, Kofi was casting his net and saw a strange boat pull near to his boat. This boat was filled with police and the people from IJM. Thanks to supporters like you, IJM and the police rescued Kofi and 9 other boys off the lake that day. Kofi would later recall how he knew this boat was different than the others he'd been on before. And when someone handed me a life jacket, that made me know, that ensured that I was safe. So it was a different narrative, it was a different story altogether. When Kofi was rescued that March morning, so much was given back to him: his freedom, his childhood, and his dignity. Because of your support to IJM, Kofi is no longer a slave. Today, this young boy is laughing and smiling again. Kofi is living his dream of going to school. Data does not build empathy in the same way that a story does. The story is one of one person. It's more emotionally powerful in the statistics than could ever be. and even a million statistics. Anything an individual might do feels insignificant and fruitless when there are still so many who need help. The statistics tend to overwhelm rather than motivate us. We connect better to the one than to the many. Empathy is a finite resource and it works best one-on-one. Turns out getting people to experience stories that help them to imagine what this reality is like for a victim helps create engagement and motivates them to act. So IJM got very many more donations and very many more people involved in their programs as a result of these messages and this work. Let's switch to the next slide, Jake. And so the best stories are really quite simple. Jake, are you there? There we go. The best stories are quite simple. They're revealing for both individuals and organizations. You become an accumulation of the stories that we tell, and as an individual, the stories we share reveal what you're about and what you share, what you find funny, what you find uplifting as an organization. Your culture as a story is really something you repeatedly share. So we see that there's a really clear formula for creating a brand story, or maybe really any story, but a brand story in particular. And that is to say that the world is a certain way, right? It's very simple. Something changes, something in the way we do business, something in our purpose changes something in the world, and then the world is now different. That's the story arc. It's just that simple. It doesn't get any more complicated than that. And so what's happening is that people then project themselves into that story. And because when you tell one story, the audience hears two stories. They hear your story and the story with them in it. We're literally putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. Jack Dorsey, who's the CEO of Twitter, is fond of saying, if you want to build a product or a brand that's relevant to folks, you need to put yourself in their shoes and write a story from their side. What happens is the brain activity of both the storyteller and the story listener starts to align, and thanks to mirror neurons, brain cells that fire not only when we perform an action, but also when we hear of someone else performing that same action. We become involved in the story. The story feels real to us. The characters feel real to us. We become completely immersed in the story, both consciously and subconsciously. This is true of empathy. Empathy in particular is something that we feel with someone else. And if we have empathy, if we feel with someone, we can better understand their point of view, better understand their perceptions, and we're naturally more invested in their story, or maybe naturally more invested in their brand. We're seeing true empathy in many of the brands that succeed today. They've discovered that it's almost impossible to find competitive advantage just from marketing or logistics or manufacturing. And what's emerged is the ability to find a simple but compelling aspect of price or value or quality or speed or convenience or service that aligns with the customer, what customers actually sense to be missing in their current choices in the market. We see brands like Southwest, Zappos, Starbucks in terms of more mature brands, but also along with emerging new brands like Warby Parker and Dollar Shave Club, Spanx, Casper mattresses. They compete against bigger brands by finding those missing links for customers and create a compelling story around their approach to solving the problem. Mind you, these are well-established, highly commoditized segments dominated by large companies. Yet, think about it, these upstart brands come along with a compelling story and business model, and they steal customer hearts and market share at an astounding rate. In fact, many of these emerging brands have become billion-dollar valued enterprises at a shockingly fast rate. Shocking at least to the established competitors who may actually have significant market share, but desperately lack a meaningful and motivating story. So just as an example, let's flip to the next slide, Jake. Warby Parker is a great example. And it's all around this notion that when you tell one story, the audience hears two stories, your story and your story with them. Now, mind you, keep in mind, this is a very highly commoditized business, right? These are eyeglasses. And so what was the opportunity? What was the logistics? What was the manufacturing opportunity? What was the way to solve a problem that no one else had detected and solved in this industry? So here's the Warby Parker story in 100 words. And this is the whole notion of telling these short, simple stories about how you change the world, and that when you tell one story, the audience hears two stories. Warby Parker produces this story on glass cleaners for eyeglasses, and they ship this little cloth with this story imprinted on it with every pair of eyeglasses. So they're proud of their story, and they share their story, and their story is meaningful. This is their story. Once upon a time, a young man left his glasses on an airplane. He tried to buy new glasses, but new glasses were expensive. Why is it so hard to buy stylish glasses without spending a fortune on them? He wondered. He returned to school and told his friends, "We should start a company to sell amazing glasses for non-insane prices," said one of his friends. "We should make shopping for glasses fun," said another. "We should distribute a pair of glasses to someone in need for every pair sold," said a third. And eureka, Warby Parker was born. That's on every glass cleaner, every lens cleaner cloth that they send out with every pair of glasses. They share that story widely and proudly. The epilogue, and they built their whole business on that. That's the important thing to take away from this. There's an epilogue attached to it as well. It says, "Thank you for reading Warby Parker in 100 words. You just read our entire history in less time than it takes to wash a dish, clean a smudge off your glasses, or consume 6 baby carrots at a responsible chewing pace. Not bad. 100 words goes by pretty fast. If you want more words, please visit warbyparker.com. Chip and Dan Heath, in their book, their really terrific book, Made to Stick, say, "We've seen that a credible idea makes people believe. An emotional idea makes people care. The right stories make people act. The right stories motivate people. Don't miss this human truth. People are storytelling machines. It's the most natural thing in the world to us. We make a story out of everything. In fact, if a brand doesn't have a story, we'll create our own story in our own minds for that brand. So if you're not telling a simple, concise, and compelling story about your brand, everyone else will. We abhor a vacuum. We fill in the blank. If we're aware of something, we also fill in the blank of what's the meaning behind that thing. So a story about your brand will be told, but it maybe won't be the story you were hoping for. So the best thing a brand can do is settle on why it exists. What purpose does it fulfill? How it helps customers live a better life? And then craft and share a simple, meaningful story that makes it clear why that brand is in the world. And of course, you have to make it come true. You'll be surprised what good things will start to happen for your brand. Thank you very much. Great to be with everyone today. I don't know if we have time for questions or not, but I'm happy to take some. We're fond of saying at Brandtrust, the brand is not part of the business, the brand is the business. And so many brands could think more purposefully about what it is they do to change the world in a positive way and tell their story in a creative and compelling way and make a big difference. There's this question here about a short story on the front page of our website. I think it's just exactly the same thing, right? Is that people are going to be attracted by a story. So unless they're coming for pricing information or something real specific on a very functional transactional page, it's always worthwhile to put the story there. And if you put the story in 100 words, it doesn't look intimidating, or it doesn't look like it's too cumbersome to read. It's always easy to make the story creative and compelling, and people will read it if it's there and available for them. So absolutely incorporate the story on the front page of your website. If you go to Brandtrust website, you can see how it's done. Oh, I think websites that change based on the visitor are really good, provided they're accurate. Sometimes they're not accurate, and sometimes the AI behind them or whatever technology is working misses a beat, and you end up getting information that is not meant for you, or not suited for you, not customized for you, and the brand loses every ounce of authenticity that it ever had in your mind at that moment, because it becomes irrelevant to you. I think an easy way to incorporate story into sales is to always make sure that you're a very active listener to customers, understand what it is that they're trying to do, the job that they're trying to complete, and to understand that they have missions for their own companies and that they're trying to do something that solves their needs, not yours. And that anytime you can frame your product in a way that solves their needs rather than talking about its features and benefits and price advantages and competitive advantages, you gain advantage when you present the product, present your brand, present your story in the customer's own voice. And you've walked in the customer's shoes to understand how to make that voice. You'll see how much more successful you'll be if you can transform your messaging in that way. A brand is allowed one message, one good one.
All right, that'll be it for Daryl. I got to hop into the next webinar, so this one's got to go down. And by the way, for all of you who are looking forward to the exhibitors, Huva just called me and back up, so their engineer succeeded. So good news.
Thank you.